blood on frost-covered leaves, marked the trail where the Dunmore family had stumbled through Virginia's winter woods. John Harper crouched beside the crimson droplets, his weathered fingers reading the story written in mud and desperation. This is the account of how one man transformed human suffering into profitable enterprise, turning the very bonds of family love into instruments of capture and death. The year 1796 found Virginia caught between two worlds. The new nation proclaimed liberty while simultaneously codifying bondage into law. In this contradiction, men like John Harper discovered opportunity. He operated from a modest farmstead outside Richmond, where the morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and wet earth, where leather creaked against his saddle, and where iron shackles clinked like wind chimes in his saddlebags. Before we delve deeper into this dark chapter of American history, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records and plantation ledgers for over 2 centuries. Harper had learned his trade from his father, who'd tracked runaways since the 1760s. But where the elder Harper worked alone, John understood that families presented both greater challenge and greater reward. A single runaway might fetch $20 in bounty. An entire family could bring 10 times that amount, especially if returned alive to serve as examples. The Dunmore family had fled Westover Plantation 3 days before Christmas. Thomas Dunmore, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children aged 6 to 15 had vanished during the night shift change, slipping past the overseer's cabin, while wind rattled bare branches loud enough to mask footsteps. The plantation owner, Colonel James Morrison, had offered Harper $50 for their return, alive if possible, though the contract contained provisions for compensation even if they were not. From Morrison's plantation records, December 22, 1796, Negroes absconded during night hours. Harper engaged for recovery. Terms discussed and agreed upon. Harper studied the blood trail with professional interest. The family was moving northeast toward the Rappahannock River, following paths used by previous escapees. But Harper knew something they didn't. He'd been tracking families long enough to understand their patterns, their desperate logic. They would avoid main roads, seek shelter in abandoned cabins, rely on help from other enslaved people along the route. What made Harper particularly effective was his understanding of love itself. Single runaways could disappear into cities, change names, blend into free communities, but families left tracks. They moved slower, needed more food, couldn't abandon injured members. Children cried. Adults made noise trying to comfort them. The trail led through a grove of winter bare oaks where the family had rested. Harper found where they'd shared what little food they carried, scraps of cornbread scattered for birds, a mother's attempt to teach kindness even while fleeing for their lives. He noted the detail in his leather-bound journal, not from sentiment but from calculation. Why did families run together when separation offered better chances of individual survival? The answer lay in Harper's understanding of human nature. He'd spent 15 years learning that enslaved people would risk everything to keep their children safe, would choose certain capture over uncertain separation. This knowledge had made him the most feared slave catcher in Central Virginia, a man who could predict where love would lead people, then use that destination against them. But the Dunmore family was about to teach Harper a lesson he'd never expected. Their trail was leading somewhere he'd never tracked a family before, toward a place that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the business of human hunting. Frozen mud crunched under Harper's boots as he reached the riverbank at dawn. The Rappahannock stretched before him like molten pewter, its surface broken by chunks of ice that clinked against the shore with each gentle wave. The family's survival now depended on crossing waters that had claimed dozens of escapees, while Harper closed the distance with methodical precision. The morning mist carried the sharp scent of winter water and decaying leaves, while frost made the dock planks slick as glass beneath Harper's leather soles. He'd tracked the Dunmores to this exact spot, following bent grass and disturbed snow, reading their desperation in every broken twig and scattered footprint. But something was wrong. The trail ended abruptly at the water's edge with no signs of a crossing attempt. No boat had been stolen from the small fishing dock. No rope or makeshift raft materials were missing. The family had simply vanished. Harper pulled out his brass spyglass and scanned the opposite shore. The Rappahannock ran nearly 200 yards wide at this point, too far for even strong swimmers in winter conditions. Children that young couldn't possibly have made such a crossing, yet the evidence suggested they'd somehow reached the other side. From Harper's Journal, December 25, 1796. Family trail ends at river's edge. No sign of drowning, no evidence of crossing. Suspicious circumstances require further investigation. What Harper didn't know was that Thomas Dunmore had spent 3 years preparing for this escape. Unlike most runaways who fled on impulse, Thomas had been methodically gathering information, resources, and allies. He'd learned about this particular crossing point from other enslaved people who'd attempted the journey, though none had ever returned to tell whether they'd succeeded. The secret lay 30 yards upstream, where a massive oak had fallen across the water the previous spring. High water had since covered the trunk, making it invisible from the main dock. But Thomas had discovered it during his reconnaissance trips, testing the route on moonless nights when he supposedly checked Morrison's livestock. Harper found the submerged crossing by following subtle scratches on bark, where the family had gripped the fallen tree for balance. The trunk lay just 18 inches below the surface, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Crossing would have required removing shoes and outer clothing, then walking across the slippery wood while ice-cold water numbed legs and feet. He calculated the timeline. A family of 6 moving carefully across would need at least 20 minutes, probably longer with small children. They'd done this in complete darkness, trusting their lives to Thomas's careful planning and a little girl's ability to stay quiet while her feet went numb in the freezing water. Justice seemed impossible when love made people this dangerous. Local watermen later reported seeing strange tracks on the far shore that Christmas morning, but Harper was the first to connect them to the missing family. He hired a ferryman to cross him over, paying double the usual rate for winter passage through the ice chunks. The opposite bank told its own story. 6 sets of footprints led away from the water, some showing the uneven gait of people whose feet were still recovering from cold water crossing. But more importantly, Harper noticed something that made his blood run cold with professional respect. Thomas Dunmore had cached dry clothes and shoes on this side of the river. The implications hit Harper like a physical blow. This wasn't a desperate flight by an unprepared family. Thomas had been planning this escape for months, maybe years. He'd made multiple trips to scout routes, establish supply caches, and study Harper's own methods. The slave was thinking like a professional. Harper had built his reputation on understanding that love made people predictable. But what happened when love combined with intelligence, planning, and patience? What happened when the hunted learned to think like the hunter? The tracks led inland toward a dense woodland area where colonial surveyors had marked trees for future lumber operations. Harper recognized the tactical advantage. Dense forest provided cover, while blazed trees offered navigation markers that only someone familiar with surveying techniques could read properly. Thomas Dunmore was leading his family along a route that required specialized knowledge to follow. Knowledge that suggested he'd been studying more than just how to cross rivers in the dark. He'd been studying how to disappear entirely. But Harper had one advantage the family couldn't anticipate. He wasn't just tracking them anymore. He was learning to think like Thomas Dunmore, to see the landscape through the eyes of someone who'd turned escape into an art form. What Harper discovered next would force him to question everything he thought he knew about the business of hunting human beings. Blazed bark caught morning light like white scars against dark wood, each mark precisely cut to guide travelers through Virginia's trackless interior. Harper followed these surveyors' marks deeper into the forest, realizing Thomas Dunmore possessed knowledge that transformed him from prey into predator. The question was no longer whether Harper would catch this family, but whether he was walking into a carefully constructed trap. Pine needles crunched underfoot with each step, releasing their sharp fragrance into air thick with morning fog. Moisture beaded on Harper's wool coat, while spiderwebs stretched between branches like nature's tripwires, each strand heavy with dew that soaked his sleeves when he pushed through. The blazed trees formed a path invisible to anyone unfamiliar with surveying techniques, leading northwest toward the Blue Ridge foothills. Harper paused beside a massive chestnut where fresh cuts revealed bright wood beneath weathered bark. The marks weren't random. They followed the systematic notation system used by colonial land surveyors, indicating not just direction, but distance, elevation changes, and landmark references. Thomas wasn't just reading these signs, he was fluent in their language. From the Virginia Land Office records, 1794, Thomas Dunmore, Negro, employed as chain bearer for surveying expedition under Robert Campbell. Compensation, food, and lodging. The document explained everything. 2 years earlier, Thomas had worked for a surveying team mapping potential railroad routes through central Virginia. While white surveyors focused on calculations and legal descriptions, Thomas had carried the chain, marked trees, and memorized every trail, creek crossing, and shelter point across hundreds of square miles. Harper's quarry had spent 2 years creating his own escape route while being paid to do it. The trail continued past a small clearing where the family had stopped to rest and eat. Harper found apple cores buried beneath leaves, evidence of forethought that impressed and unsettled him. Most runaways carried whatever food they could grab during flight. Thomas had packed supplies like a man planning a journey, not fleeing a nightmare. But the apple cores revealed something else. They were too fresh, too numerous for a family that had fled 3 days ago. Someone had been eating here recently, within the last 24 hours. Harper felt the hair on his neck rise as professional instinct warred with growing unease. The hunter was being hunted. Harper examined the ground more carefully, finding boot prints that didn't match the Dunmore family's tracks. At least 3 different sets of footprints converged in this clearing, all made by people familiar with moving quietly through dense forest. Thomas hadn't just planned an escape route. He'd organized support. The realization struck Harper like cold water. This wasn't a desperate family fleeing alone through hostile territory. This was a coordinated operation involving multiple people with specialized knowledge, supplies, and safe houses positioned along a predetermined route. Harper had tracked hundreds of runaways over 15 years, but he'd never encountered anything like this level of organization. Individual slaves occasionally received help from sympathetic free blacks or abolitionists. But a network capable of supporting entire families required resources, communication systems, and security measures that suggested something approaching military precision. He found evidence of that precision in the next mile. The trail split at a rocky outcrop where 2 paths diverged around a steep hillside. Fresh tracks went both directions, but careful examination revealed the deception. The lighter tracks heading east were made by someone walking backward in the original footprints, creating false evidence of passage while the real trail continued north. Thomas was teaching Harper's own techniques back to him. The north trail led to an abandoned trapper's cabin built into a natural rock shelter. The structure was small but solid, with a stone fireplace and wooden shutters that could block light from inside. Harper approached carefully, noting signs of recent habitation without current occupation. Inside, the cabin told its story through small details. 6 sleeping spaces arranged around cold ashes in the fireplace, food scraps buried behind the cabin, a cache of dry firewood hidden beneath a tarp, ready for use but invisible to casual inspection. The Dunmore family had stayed here 1 full night, resting in safety while Harper wasted time tracking false trails near the river crossing. But they'd left something behind that made Harper's blood run cold. Carved into the wooden mantle was a message in clear letters: "For all those who would be free. T.D." Thomas Dunmore could read and write. He'd been leaving markers not just for his own family, but for future escapees who might follow this route. The cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was a station on an organized network designed to help enslaved families reach freedom. Harper sank into the cabin's single chair, overwhelmed by implications that redefined everything he thought he understood about his profession. He wasn't tracking an escaped slave family. He was confronting an organized resistance network that had been operating under his nose for years, using his own techniques against him while building infrastructure for systematic liberation. But if Thomas could organize support networks and plan escape routes with military precision, what was to stop him from planning something even more ambitious? What was to stop him from deciding that being hunted was less preferable than eliminating the hunter permanently? Harper's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his side as he realized the cabin's strategic position offered perfect sight lines in all directions. Anyone approaching could be seen long before they posed a threat. Anyone inside could disappear through multiple exit routes before pursuers could surround the structure. The Dunmore family was still 2 days ahead of him, but Harper was beginning to understand that staying ahead had never been their primary objective. They were leading him somewhere specific, somewhere they'd prepared for his arrival, somewhere they intended to finish this hunt permanently. Smoke rose from chimneys across the valley, like gray fingers reaching toward overcast skies. Harper crouched on the ridge overlooking Millfield Settlement, watching enslaved and free blacks move between cabins with the coordinated purpose of people who shared more than proximity. Below him lay the infrastructure of organized resistance, a community that had been hiding its true nature in plain sight while he'd spent years hunting individuals who were never truly alone. The settlement stretched along Mill Creek, where the sound of running water masked conversations and the smell of wood smoke camouflaged signals sent between cabins. Harper felt the rough bark of an oak against his back, while damp leaves soaked through his knees, his spyglass revealing details that reframed everything he thought he knew about the landscape of bondage and freedom in Virginia. 23 cabins housed nearly 100 people, officially recorded as belonging to various local plantation owners who hired them out for millwork, carpentry, and seasonal labor. But Harper now recognized the arrangement's true purpose. This wasn't just a settlement, it was a fortress disguised as a workforce, a place where enslaved people could live with relative independence while building the networks that made escape possible. Thomas Dunmore hadn't just planned his family's route. He'd helped create the entire system that supported it. From the Spotsylvania County tax records, 1795, Mill Creek Settlement, population, 87 souls. Status, hired laborers under various ownership. Assessment, productive and orderly. The official description revealed nothing about the reality Harper was witnessing through his spyglass. Men moved between cabins, carrying tools that looked like carpentry supplies, but were positioned like military equipment. Women gathered at what appeared to be a communal kitchen, but were actually exchanging information with the precision of intelligence operatives. Children played games that taught them to move quietly, hide quickly, and communicate through gestures rather than words. An entire generation was being trained in the skills necessary for organized resistance. Harper watched a man approach one of the cabins carrying what looked like a routine delivery of supplies, but the interaction that followed was anything but routine. The man knocked in a specific pattern: 2 short, 1 long, 3 short. The door opened immediately, without the hesitation typical of people verifying a visitor's identity. The signal system suggested communication networks that extended far beyond this single settlement. Harper was looking at one node in a larger organization that probably covered most of central Virginia, possibly extending into neighboring states. But the most unsettling revelation came When Harper recognized one of the figures moving between cabins, Samuel Morrison, officially listed as Colonel Morrison's personal driver, was supposed to be at Westover Plantation attending to his owner's business. Instead, he was here in Millfield Settlement, coordinating activities with the careful authority of someone holding significant responsibility. Love had built an army. The realization struck Harper with physical force. Every enslaved person he'd ever tracked had been connected to networks like this. Every family that had tried to escape together had been supported by communities of people willing to risk everything to keep children with their parents, wives with their husbands, families intact despite laws designed to tear them apart. He'd spent 15 years believing he was hunting desperate individuals, making impulsive decisions. In reality, he'd been fighting an organized movement that had been studying his methods, adapting to his tactics, and building systems specifically designed to counter his expertise. Harper lowered his spyglass and considered his options. The Dunmore family was almost certainly in Millfield Settlement, probably resting in one of those cabins while community members prepared the next stage of their journey. He could ride down immediately, demand cooperation, threaten consequences for harboring fugitives. But approaching an organized community was vastly different from tracking isolated runaways. These people had numbers, coordination, and defensive positions. More importantly, they had nothing left to lose. Enslaved people who committed to organized resistance understood that capture meant not just return to bondage, but brutal punishment designed to terrorize others who might consider similar actions. Harper had built his reputation on understanding that love made people vulnerable, but love could also make people desperate enough to fight with the ferocity of cornered animals protecting their young. From his position on the ridge, Harper could see multiple escape routes leading away from Millfield Settlement, paths that wound through dense forest toward river crossings, mountain passes, and other settlements. Thomas hadn't just planned his family's escape. He'd helped design a system that could move people systematically from bondage to freedom. The trail Harper had been following was never meant to be invisible. It was meant to lead him here, to this moment, when he would have to choose between confronting an organized community or admitting that some hunts were too dangerous to pursue. But as Harper studied the settlement through his spyglass, he noticed something that changed his calculations entirely. Smoke wasn't just rising from chimneys. It was forming patterns against the overcast sky, systematic signals that suggested the entire community was already aware of his presence on the ridge. They weren't hiding from him anymore. They were waiting for him to make the next move. Harper's hand moved instinctively to his pistol as he realized the tactical situation had reversed completely. He was no longer the hunter approaching unsuspecting prey. He was a lone man with a single weapon facing a community that had spent years preparing for exactly this confrontation. Thomas Dunmore had led him into more than a trap. He'd led him into a revolution disguised as a settlement, where the hunted had learned to become hunters and love had learned to fight back with methodical precision. But what Harper couldn't see from his position on the ridge was the figure watching him through a spyglass from the opposite hillside, calculating distances and wind patterns with the expertise of someone trained in more than surveying. Metal glinted in the afternoon sun as Harper's spyglass caught light from across the valley. Someone on the opposite ridge was watching him watch them, turning surveillance into a deadly game of mirrors. Harper's 15 years of professional hunting had never prepared him for the moment when he became the prey, when his expertise would be used to orchestrate his own destruction. The forest around Harper carried the whisper of wind through bare branches, the musty scent of decomposing leaves, and the rough texture of granite beneath his boots as he shifted position on the rocky outcrop. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his spyglass, trying to locate the figure he'd glimpsed on the far hillside. The metallic click of his weapon's hammer being pulled back echoed in the silence, a sound that seemed to announce his presence to every creature within a mile. Through the lens, Harper could see the settlement's careful choreography continuing below. But now he understood the movements differently. Children weren't just playing, they were serving as lookouts, their games providing cover for a sophisticated observation system. Women weren't just cooking, they were preparing supplies for people who might need to disappear quickly. Men weren't just working, they were maintaining equipment that could serve defensive as well as productive purposes. The figure on the opposite ridge moved with deliberate purpose, no longer trying to remain hidden. Harper focused his spyglass and felt his stomach drop as he recognized the tall, lean silhouette of Thomas Dunmore himself. From Harper's journal, December 28, 1796. Quarry has assumed Hunter's position. Tactical situation compromised. Recommend immediate withdrawal. But withdrawal was no longer possible. Harper realized with growing horror that his own careful tracking had been anticipated, his route predicted, his position calculated. Thomas hadn't been fleeing through unfamiliar territory. He'd been leading Harper along a path designed to bring them to this exact confrontation at this exact location. The settlement below wasn't hiding the Dunmore family. It was protecting the person who'd orchestrated this entire encounter. Harper watched through his spyglass as Thomas raised his own viewing instrument, not a crude improvised telescope, but a military-grade spyglass that must have cost more than most enslaved people saw in a lifetime. The two men studied each other across the valley, professional to professional, hunter to hunter. The hunt had become mutual. Thomas lowered his spyglass and gestured toward the settlement below. Following his indication, Harper saw something that made his blood freeze. 23 cabins, but now he could count at least 40 men positioned around the settlement's perimeter, not hiding, not fleeing, but taking defensive positions with the coordinated precision of trained soldiers. Harper was looking at a military operation disguised as a community, commanded by a man who'd spent 2 years studying, not just surveying techniques, but tactical planning, defensive positioning, and the art of turning pursuit into ambush. A sharp whistle echoed across the valley, followed by 2 more in quick succession. The signal prompted immediate movement below as people began emerging from cabins carrying long rifles, powder horns, and ammunition pouches. These weren't farming tools hastily converted to weapons. This was military equipment maintained by people who knew how to use it. Harper counted at least 15 rifles, probably more concealed in the cabins. Against his single pistol and whatever surprise he might maintain, the mathematics were brutally clear. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and occupying the tactically inferior position on high ground that could easily be surrounded. But the most terrifying realization came when Harper understood the true purpose of Thomas's positioning on the opposite ridge. He wasn't there to observe or coordinate. He was there to cut off Harper's retreat route, turning the valley into a killing ground with no escape. The professional in Harper had to admire the planning involved. Thomas had spent months, maybe years, preparing for this confrontation. He'd studied Harper's methods, anticipated his routes, and created a scenario where superior firepower would be supported by perfect tactical positioning. Harper had walked into the most sophisticated trap of his professional career, designed by someone who'd learned to think like him while possessing resources he'd never imagined possible. Through his spyglass, Harper watched Thomas stand and walk to the edge of his rocky perch, no longer concerned about concealment. At this distance, Harper could see the man's face clearly for the first time. Thomas Dunmore wasn't showing fear or desperation. He was displaying the calm confidence of someone executing a carefully rehearsed plan. What made a slave become dangerous enough to outthink a professional hunter? The answer lay in something Harper had never considered during 15 years of tracking runaways. He'd always assumed that enslaved people who fled were responding to immediate crises, brutal punishments, family separations, intolerable conditions. But Thomas represented something entirely different. Thomas was a man who'd been planning revolution while pretending servility, building military networks while carrying surveying chains, organizing resistance while appearing compliant. He represented the terrifying possibility that bondage might create not just victims, but strategists, not just refugees, but revolutionaries. Harper lowered his spyglass as the tactical situation became undeniably clear. He could retreat immediately and likely escape with his life, abandoning the hunt and forfeiting his reputation. He could attempt to negotiate, though his position offered no leverage for meaningful bargaining. Or he could advance toward the settlement and discover whether Thomas's revolution was prepared to kill a white man in broad daylight in front of witnesses, with consequences that would bring every militia unit in Virginia to hunt them down. The choice would define not just Harper's fate, but the nature of resistance itself, because Thomas wasn't just protecting his family anymore. He was challenging the entire system that made Harper's profession possible. Across the valley, Thomas raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or a signal. Within seconds, Harper heard the sound of footsteps approaching through the forest behind him, multiple sets moving with practiced stealth. The trap was closing, and Harper finally understood that he'd never been hunting the Dunmore family at all. He'd been hunting a revolution that had decided to hunt him back. Boots crunched through frozen leaves behind Harper as three figures emerged from the tree line, their movements coordinated with military precision. Each man carried a long rifle and wore the rough clothing of field hands, but their eyes held the steady focus of trained soldiers. Harper was about to discover that Thomas Dunmore's revolution had been recruiting members from every plantation in central Virginia, turning individual acts of resistance into coordinated warfare. The December cold bit through Harper's wool coat, while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. The scent of gun oil and wood smoke drifted from the men approaching behind him, mixing with the metallic taste of fear that filled his mouth. His fingers found the rough grip of his pistol, but 6 shots against multiple rifles represented mathematics that even desperation couldn't solve. "Mr. Harper," the voice came from directly behind him, calm and respectful in tone, but carrying unmistakable authority. "Been expecting you for near 3 days now." Harper turned slowly, keeping his hands visible but ready. The man who'd spoken was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a leather apron that marked him as a blacksmith. His companions flanked him at precise intervals that prevented Harper from targeting more than one at a time. "Don't recognize you," Harper said, calculating distances and angles while maintaining conversational tone. "Name's Joshua. Work for Colonel Pemberton over in King George County. Least, that's what the papers say." Joshua's slight smile held no warmth. "Truth is, I work for something bigger than any one plantation owner." From Intercepted Correspondence, December 15, 1796. Network operations expanding. Recruitment successful across 7 counties. Leadership structure solidifying under central command. The document hadn't made sense when Harper first read it in Colonel Morrison's office 3 weeks ago. Now its meaning crystallized with terrifying clarity. Thomas Dunmore hadn't just organized his family's escape, he'd built a military organization that recruited from plantations across Virginia, creating a shadow army hidden within the institution of slavery itself. Joshua gestured toward the valley below, where Harper could see additional figures moving with purpose between the cabins. "Thomas told us you'd come this way. Said you were smart enough to figure out the trail, dedicated enough to follow it alone, professional enough to walk right into the trap he'd been building for 2 years. Harper felt something cold settle in his stomach as the true scope of his situation became clear. This wasn't an improvised response to his tracking. This was the culmination of a plan that had anticipated his methods, studied his psychology, and prepared for this exact confrontation. 2 years, Harper repeated, the timeline clicking into place. Since he worked the surveying crew, since he learned how white folks think about territory, strategy, and warfare. Joshua's voice carried satisfaction mixed with something harder. Thomas spent those months walking your land, learning your methods, studying how you track families. Then he came back and taught us everything. The revolution had learned to think like Harper, while Harper remained ignorant of their existence. They'd turned his own expertise into weapons pointed directly at him. Harper looked across the valley toward Thomas's position on the opposite ridge. The man was still visible, still watching, but no longer alone. 3 more figures had joined him, creating a command post that overlooked the entire tactical situation. "What does he want?" Harper asked, though he suspected the answer would redefine everything he thought he knew about the business of slave catching. "To finish what you started 15 years ago," Joshua replied. "You made hunting families your profession. Thomas made stopping you his calling." The words carried weight that went far beyond personal vengeance. Harper was looking at systemic resistance, organized opposition that had identified him as a primary threat and developed specific strategies to neutralize that threat permanently. Below in the valley, Harper could see children being moved into specific cabins, while adults took defensive positions around the settlement's perimeter. This wasn't just about protecting the Dunmore family anymore. This was about eliminating the threat that Harper represented to every family that might seek freedom in the future. Death had become a military objective. Harper realized with growing horror that Thomas had never intended to simply escape with his family. The entire flight had been designed to lure Harper into position for execution, turning the hunter's expertise against him while demonstrating to every enslaved person in Virginia that even the most feared slave catcher could be killed. "You're planning to murder me," Harper said, stating the obvious while calculating whether sudden movement might create opportunity for escape. "Planning to execute you," Joshua corrected, "for crimes against families, children, mothers trying to keep their babies safe." Thomas spent 2 years documenting every hunt you've completed, every family you've destroyed, every child separated from their parents because of your work. The accusation struck Harper with unexpected force, not because it was untrue, but because it framed his profession in terms he'd never considered. He'd always seen himself as a businessman, fulfilling legal contracts, enforcing property law, maintaining social order. But from the perspective of the people he'd hunted, he was something entirely different. He was a destroyer of families, a separator of children from parents, a force that turned love itself into vulnerability. 15 years, Joshua continued. You've made money destroying what we hold most sacred. Time someone showed you what happens when love learns to fight back. Harper looked around the tactical situation with professional assessment overriding personal fear. 6 rifles minimum, defensive positions, coordinated command structure, escape routes blocked. Even if he could somehow fight his way out of the immediate confrontation, Thomas had positioned the entire resistance network to track him across any terrain he might attempt to traverse. The hunter had become completely and systematically trapped by people who'd studied hunting until they understood it better than he did. But as Harper calculated his dwindling options, he noticed something that suggested Thomas's revolution might have made one crucial mistake. The positioning was perfect for eliminating a single target, but it was also perfect for demonstrating to every militia unit in Virginia exactly how organized and dangerous this resistance network had become. Killing Harper would solve one problem, while creating a much larger one, and Harper wondered whether Thomas understood the consequences of turning slave catching into warfare. What happened when revolution announced itself through the execution of a white man in broad daylight? Thomas Dunmore's voice carried across the valley like a judge pronouncing sentence, each word echoing off the rocky hillsides with the finality of a closing trap. Harper watched as the man he'd been hunting raised a long rifle, its barrel catching afternoon sunlight like a promise of death. This moment would determine whether organized resistance could survive the consequences of killing a white man, or whether revolution would destroy itself through necessary violence. The December air crackled with tension, as thick as the wood smoke rising from settlement chimneys below. Harper felt granite rough against his back as he pressed against the rocky outcrop, while the metallic scent of gunpowder drifted from the weapons trained on him. Around him, the forest held its breath, as if every tree understood that what happened next would reshape the landscape of bondage and freedom across Virginia. John Harper, Thomas called from across the valley, his voice carrying the formal tone of a man conducting official business. 15 years you've hunted our families. 15 years you've separated children from mothers, husbands from wives. Today, that ends. Harper calculated angles and distances with professional instinct, even as sweat froze on his forehead. 6 rifles within 20 yards, at least 10 more positioned around the valley's perimeter, and Thomas himself commanding the high ground with clear sight lines. The mathematics of survival offered no encouragement, but Harper understood something about violence that Thomas's revolution might have overlooked. Killing a white slave catcher wouldn't just eliminate one threat, it would transform individual acts of resistance into an organized rebellion that demanded military response from every militia unit in Virginia. From the Virginia militia records, January 2nd, 1797. Reports of armed resistance require immediate mobilization. Colonel Patterson authorized to use necessary force in suppressing organized insurrection among the Negro population. The document Harper had never seen would be written within days of his death, transforming Thomas's tactical victory into strategic disaster. But standing in the crosshairs of coordinated firepower, Harper couldn't warn them about consequences he could only imagine. Joshua stepped closer, his rifle steady and professional in grip and stance. Thomas says you're a student of hunting techniques. Time you learned what it feels like to be the prey. Harper had spent 15 years perfecting the art of psychological intimidation, using fear to force compliance from people who had no other options. Now those same techniques were being applied to him with methodical precision, demonstrating how completely his expertise had been absorbed and reversed. Revolution always tastes like blood. You kill me, Harper said, calculating whether conversation might create opportunity for movement. And they'll burn every settlement from here to Richmond. They'll hunt down every person who helped you, every family that supported you. Maybe, Joshua replied without lowering his weapon. But they'll do that anyway, soon as Thomas's network gets big enough to threaten the whole system. At least this way, families will know someone finally made you pay for what you've done. The logic was brutally simple. The resistance network was already large enough to attract violent suppression once discovered. Killing Harper wouldn't increase their danger. It would just ensure he couldn't add to the suffering they were trying to prevent. Harper looked across the valley toward Thomas, who was adjusting his rifle sights with the careful precision of someone trained in more than surveying. The man had planned this execution down to the smallest detail, choosing location, timing, and witnesses to maximize both symbolic impact and tactical advantage. But as Harper studied the scene, he noticed something that suggested Thomas's military planning might contain a crucial flaw. The settlement below was positioned perfectly for defense against individual threats, but it was also positioned perfectly for siege by organized forces. Stone buildings that provided cover could become traps if surrounded. The defensive positions that controlled approach routes could be isolated and eliminated systematically by professional soldiers. Thomas had built a fortress that could destroy one hunter, but might not survive the army that would come after him. Thomas, Harper called across the valley. Gambling that conversation might reveal information about the network's broader plans. You've studied my methods. Have you studied what happens when resistance becomes warfare? The question hung in the cold air while Thomas adjusted his position, bringing his rifle to bear with movements that spoke of extensive training. Whatever answer he might have given was interrupted by the sound Harper had been dreading: horses approaching through the forest at speed, multiple riders converging on the valley from different directions. The trap had become more complicated, and Harper couldn't tell whether the arriving forces represented salvation or the final element in Thomas's planned execution. But as the hoofbeats grew louder, Harper realized that someone else had been tracking this confrontation, someone with resources and coordination that matched Thomas's network. The question was whether they'd arrived to witness Harper's execution or to prevent it. The revolution was about to discover that it wasn't the only force that had been planning for this moment. Dust clouds rose between the trees as Colonel Patterson's militia thundered into the valley, their sabers catching winter sunlight like flashing teeth. 20 mounted soldiers had been tracking the same trail as Harper, but with orders that transformed individual pursuit into military suppression. The confrontation was about to escalate from execution to massacre, with Harper trapped between two forces that wanted him dead for entirely different reasons. Leather creaked and metal jingled as the militia horses slowed to a coordinated halt at the valley's edge, their riders scanning the settlement below with professional assessment. The smell of horse sweat mixed with gunpowder, while frost-hardened ground vibrated under hoofbeats that announced the arrival of official violence. Harper felt his position shift from victim to witness as the tactical situation exploded beyond anyone's control. Colonel Patterson raised his hand, signaling his men to form a perimeter around the settlement. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience when he called across the valley to both Harper and Thomas. By order of Governor James Wood, all persons involved in armed resistance will surrender immediately or face military consequences. The militia had been tracking the resistance network for weeks, following reports of organized activity that suggested coordinated rebellion rather than individual escape attempts. Harper's hunt had intersected with a larger military operation designed to eliminate what authorities saw as an existential threat to Virginia's social order. Thomas remained positioned on his ridge, but his rifle was now trained on the militia rather than Harper. The tactical mathematics had shifted completely, transforming a planned execution into a three-way standoff where any movement might trigger violence that would consume everyone present. From Colonel Patterson's dispatch, December 30th, 1796, network identified and surrounded. Estimate 40 to 50 armed combatants. Recommend immediate action to prevent escape and further recruitment. Harper realized with growing horror that his individual hunt had become the catalyst for something much larger. The militia hadn't come to rescue him. They'd come to eliminate the entire resistance network, using his presence as justification for a massacre that would serve as an example to enslaved people across Virginia. Joshua and his companions kept their rifles trained on Harper while tracking the militia's movements with obvious concern. They were caught between executing their planned target and defending against immediate military threat, forced to choose between personal justice and community survival. Harper, Colonel Patterson called, identify your position and prepare for extraction. The order carried implications that chilled Harper's blood. Extraction suggested the militia planned to eliminate everyone else present, using Harper's safety as justification for comprehensive violence. His individual pursuit was about to become the pretext for organized slaughter. No extraction necessary, Harper called back, calculating whether cooperation with the militia would guarantee survival or simply delay his death. Situation is under control, but the situation was anything but controlled. The militia's arrival had transformed a carefully planned confrontation into chaos that served no one's interests. Thomas's network faced immediate destruction. The militia faced coordinated resistance from defensive positions, and Harper remained trapped between forces that saw him as either target or excuse. Revolution had become warfare, and warfare served different rules than justice. Below in the settlement, Harper could see families disappearing into prepared hiding places while armed men took positions behind stone walls and wooden barriers. Children vanished into cellars and root houses that had been designed for exactly this scenario, while adults prepared for siege warfare that would determine whether organized resistance could survive military suppression. Thomas's voice carried across the valley with new urgency as he addressed both the militia and the settlement simultaneously. Every person here is a free citizen of Virginia, defending their homes against illegal aggression. The claim was legally meaningless but tactically brilliant, forcing the militia to choose between acknowledging the resistance network's legitimacy or conducting an obvious massacre of people claiming constitutional protection. Colonel Patterson responded by ordering his men to advance toward the settlement in formation, sabers drawn and pistols ready. The military answer to legal complexity was overwhelming force applied without hesitation or mercy. Harper watched the advance with professional recognition of tactics he'd seen used against Native American villages during his younger years. This wasn't law enforcement, this was warfare, designed to eliminate an entire community while leaving few witnesses to describe what had actually happened. The first shot came from Thomas's position on the ridge, the sound echoing off valley walls like thunder announcing a storm. The bullet struck the ground near Patterson's horse, close enough to demonstrate accuracy while serving as warning rather than attack. But warnings had no place in military operations designed to eliminate threats completely. Patterson's return signal sent 20 rifles firing simultaneously toward both Thomas's position and the settlement below, beginning a battle that would redefine resistance and suppression across Virginia. Harper threw himself behind the rocky outcrop as bullets whined overhead, realizing that his individual hunt had triggered violence that would consume everyone present. The mathematics of survival no longer involved personal escape. They involved choosing sides in warfare that would determine the future of organized resistance throughout the South. The revolution had learned to fight, but fighting meant dying, and dying meant failing the families they'd sworn to protect. Even today, locals near Millfield claim that on certain December nights, you can still hear gunfire echoing through the valley, where love learned to wage war against systematic oppression. Gunpowder smoke drifted through bare winter trees like fog, carrying the ghosts of the dead. When the shooting finally stopped, 23 bodies lay scattered across Millfield Settlement, while the survivors faced consequences that would reshape resistance and suppression throughout Virginia. The battle had ended not with victory, but with mutual destruction, proving that when love learns to wage war, everyone pays the price in blood. Silence filled the valley after the final rifle shot echoed off rocky hillsides, broken only by the crackle of burning cabins and the distant sound of horses retreating through frozen forest. Harper emerged from behind his rocky shelter to survey carnage that exceeded anything he'd witnessed during 15 years of slave catching. The smell of gunpowder mixed with wood smoke, while ice-cold air carried the metallic scent of blood across ground littered with weapons and bodies. Colonel Patterson lay motionless beside his fallen horse, struck down by Thomas's precise rifle work in the battle's opening minutes. 7 militiamen had died in the coordinated ambush that followed, caught in crossfire from defensive positions they'd underestimated. But the military response had been devastating in return, reducing the carefully constructed settlement to smoking ruins populated by the dead and dying. Thomas Dunmore's revolution had won the battle while losing the war. Harper found Joshua's body near the settlement's central well, his rifle still clutched in hands that would never again carry surveying chains or forge documents for escaping families. The blacksmith had died defending people he'd helped organize, killed by the same military forces his resistance had made inevitable. But Joshua wasn't alone among the casualties. Harper counted 16 members of the resistance network dead, including 3 women who'd been coordinating supply networks and 2 men who'd served as communication liaisons with other settlements. The battle had decapitated the organized leadership that had made systematic escape possible across central Virginia. From the Virginia Gazette, January 8, 1797. Armed insurrection suppressed in Spotsylvania County. Military casualties sustained. Governor Wood authorizes expanded patrols to prevent future organized resistance. The newspaper account sanitized reality with bureaucratic language, transforming systematic slaughter into official policy while ignoring the families destroyed on both sides of the conflict. Harper climbed toward Thomas's position on the opposite ridge, following a trail marked by blood drops that showed the man had been wounded during the fighting, but had managed to escape. The rocky outcrop where Thomas had commanded the battle was empty, except for spent rifle cartridges and a leather-bound journal abandoned in apparent haste. The journal contained detailed records of the resistance network's operations, including maps of escape routes, lists of safe houses, and profiles of sympathetic contacts across Virginia and neighboring states. But more importantly, it contained something that chilled Harper's professional soul. Detailed records of every family he'd ever tracked, every child he'd separated from parents, every life he'd destroyed in service to the business of human hunting. Thomas had been building a case against Harper with legal precision, documenting crimes that no court would ever prosecute, but history would never forget. The final entry, dated the morning of the battle, contained 4 words that redefined everything Harper thought he understood about the man he'd been hunting. Sarah and the children. Harper's blood froze as he realized the truth. Thomas Dunmore hadn't just been organizing resistance and planning Harper's execution. He'd been protecting his wife and children, who were never in Millfield Settlement at all. The entire confrontation had been a diversion, designed to draw military attention away from the real escape route his family was following toward freedom. The hunt had succeeded while failing completely. Harper closed the journal and looked across the destroyed settlement toward forest paths that led north toward Pennsylvania and Canada. Somewhere in that wilderness, Sarah Dunmore was leading 4 children toward freedom, while their father's sacrifice bought them time and distance from pursuit. Thomas had won the game Harper never realized they were playing, trading his life and his revolution for his family's escape, using Harper's expertise against him while achieving the only victory that mattered to a man whose daughters called him father. But Harper's professional calculation was interrupted by sound that changed everything. Horses approaching from multiple directions, more militia units converging on the valley in response to reports of organized resistance. The battle at Millfield Settlement was about to become the pretext for systematic suppression across Virginia. Harper faced a choice that would define the remainder of his career. He could report the truth about Thomas's network, providing authorities with information that would help them track and eliminate similar organizations. Or he could destroy the evidence, protecting communities he'd spent 15 years hunting while abandoning the profession that had defined his life. Standing in the ruins of a revolution built on love and destroyed by violence, Harper made his decision. He opened Thomas's journal and began tearing out pages, feeding them to a small fire built from broken rifle stocks and scattered papers. The documentation burned away like smoke, carrying secrets into winter air, while Harper wrote his own final entry in the case of the Dunmore family. Subjects deceased. Trail ended. Investigation concluded. Harper never hunted escaped families again. The business of slave catching continued across Virginia, but without his expertise, success rates plummeted, while escape networks learned to operate with new sophistication born from studying Thomas's methods. What Harper never discovered was whether Thomas survived the battle. Blood trails led into dense forest, but no body was ever found, leaving questions that would haunt Harper for the remainder of his life. Some say that on December nights when frost covers the ground near what used to be Millfield Settlement, you can still hear the sound of surveying chains carried by someone marking trails toward freedom. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.